let's get started. So why do we need a revenue toolkit and how did we get here? I think for every city, you know a little bit about the property tax system and Measure 5 and 50. So a brief overview, Measure 5 passed in 1990. It put limits on both schools and general government taxes when it comes to the property tax system. And those limits only apply to your operating taxes, not your bonds. But there's something that happens when you reach these limits as a taxing district. You go into compression, and we'll talk about that later. But then a couple years later, there was another measure, Measure 50. It passed in 1997. It repealed a different measure, Measure 47, that is unimportant to this conversation, and it created a permanent tax rate. And for some people, that meant it froze people's permanent rate in at zero, so they can't collect property taxes. It also created a new system of assessed value, which was set to 90% of the 1996 or 1995-96 value for each property. It also made assessed value only grow 3% every year, which is not enough to cover city services and what all of you guys do as critical needs for your communities. And then it also created a complex calculation of how you bring new property onto your tax rolls that ties it back to the 1997 and 96 tax rates. So typically, when you bring on new property, it comes in valued less than it would be today. And that means we don't grow with real market value. So here's a slide that will show you and a graph that kind of illustrates if we were to grow with the market, cities would kind of feel the impacts of the market for real market value. But instead, because of the change in Measure 50, we only grow at 3% assessed value every year. And so we grow nice and steady, which is hypothetically good for the voters because they know what to expect, but it also makes it hard to budget for critical services right now. The other issue with the property tax system and just taxes in general in Oregon is that Oregon typically uses less revenue tools than other states. So typically when you see states on the right, you see they have property taxes, they have income taxes, and they have sales tax. I know I don't have to tell you that sales tax is not a popular thing in the state of Oregon. And so we already cut out one of those tools from our three-legged stool. So we're on a two-legged stool where property taxes tend to be what local governments use and is their main source of funding, and income taxes, which is the state's main source of funding. And now they also fund schools with those revenues, and that was one of the changes that happened under Measure 5. So we all knew this, that cities have struggled to keep up with rising costs since the inception of Measure 5 and 50. And LOC's board of directors and their finance committee also know this and have continued to look in and study this. In a 2023 survey, the LOC found that most cities are approaching a budget shortfall within the next 5 years. About 60% of cities are preparing for major budget cuts and budget deficits. So that led us to starting off a revenue reform project. So we hired our great consultants led by Christian Gaston, who's here today, to help with the project. So a little bit of the project timeline, we hired our consultants in February of 2024. In April of 2024, we did technical research on potential reforms that could help cities' budget holes. This was both in the property tax system and outside of the property tax system and just general tax structure of Oregon. Things like the kicker were evaluated and other things like a sales tax. Then we did statewide focus groups. We did 6 focus groups in Pendleton, Medford, Coos Bay, Springfield, and Portland. And we got lots of good information on all of this technical information. And then in September, we launched a statewide survey to do some polling on the concepts to see how the voters reacted to them. And then at the end of 2024 and the beginning of this year, We produced the Revenue Reform Toolkit, which we're here to talk about today, which was a major deliverable to just kind of provide a comprehensive guide of what cities are doing right now and what you might be able to do if you have a revenue strategy you want to bring out to your city. And then we also brought some recommendations for future work to the board of directors, and there will be more on that later from your LOC staff.